Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for joining us today on our QuickBooks Enterprise Deep Dive webinar. My name is Dina Nall. I am going to be your host today. We're going to be talking about creating a vendor in QuickBooks Enterprise. So let's dive in today. I'm going to be working in just a sample file here in QuickBooks Enterprise. And we're talking about how do we create a vendor, what fields are important, what fields can be used in reporting, things like that. So as with most things in QuickBooks Enterprise, there are several ways that we can go about creating a vendor. Okay, we can go up to our vendor center here, create a vendor from there. We can click vendors here. If we've got our icon bar, we can click our vendor icon here. And then if we are on a purchase transaction of some kind, a purchase order, a bill, a check, a credit card charge entry, we can also add a vendor from there as well. So we'll show you both of those options. So we're just going to go to our vendor center here. And to create that new vendor, we'll click right here where it says new vendor and click on new vendor here. So if you were here last week, we talked about creating a customer, and we talked about how that customer name has to be unique. It cannot be repeated on any other list data within QuickBooks, right? So the same thing is going to be necessary for our vendor names. So if we have a customer who is also a vendor, we're going to have to differentiate those names somehow. If we have multiple accounts, for example, if we've got more than one AT&T account or more than one utility account, right, and we want to keep those as separate vendors, then we would have to differentiate those vendors somehow in our vendor name, right? So for example, if we have multiple AT&T accounts, we might put the last 4 or 5 digits of our account number after each of those vendors so that we can keep those accounts straight. Now the company name, that's a little bit different. That one can be repeated. That's not the unique identifier here in QuickBooks Enterprise. So if we do need to separate out vendors, we can always have the company name be the same. There's also another field, a third field we'll talk about for where we can put the print on check name for those vendors, right? So that we don't write a check to AT&T-5538, right? We just need the check to go to AT&T. We'll get to that. The opening balance field here, again, we don't recommend that you use this if when you are creating this vendor, you owe them $500 and you put $500 in here, and then you go to create the bill to pay them that $500, you're actually going to double up what you owe that vendor, right? This isn't just going to put a number here, it's actually going to create a transaction in the system for you, but it doesn't give you the chance to post where that expense should go, doesn't give you a chance to separate that out. Maybe you owe 2 different invoices in that $500, right? So we don't recommend that you use this field here. That is a field that can be turned off in QuickBooks Enterprise. If we go to our preferences here and we go to accounting, company preferences, we can choose to hide that opening balance field so that our AP clerk or anybody else who might be putting data into the file, they don't use that field by accident. Okay? So like I said, our company name here, this can be the same as any other name in QuickBooks, whether it's a vendor or customer or anything else. It does not have to be unique. If we have a care of, right, somebody specific that we need to make the checks out to, or somebody specific that we know processes our checks when we issue those payments to our vendor, we can put their information here. If we wanted to include job title, any of their contact information, again, you can change these. We have a lot of different options here, but we tend to recommend that these first 2 fields, main phone and main email, remain those categories. We can't always import data into the secondary, tertiary fields down here. Pardon me. So if there's data that we want to make sure that we are able to import, we want to use those first couple of fields. If you noticed when I put my company name in here, it also populated down here in my billed from address, right? So if we think about when we issue a check to a vendor, if we are still mailing checks, which a lot of us do, this is the information that's going to go on that check to be mailed, or on that check stub when we mail it, okay? So we want to make sure that that company name is here. Otherwise, it's just going to have an address on there, and there might be 3 or 4 companies at that address, and they don't really know where that check needs to go, right? So we want to make sure that our company name is filled in and that it exists as this first line here, okay? We can put in the rest of our address here. Oops, if I could spell. Okay. If we click our little edit button here, we can see that QuickBooks is going to pull that apart for me into city, state, zip. If I need to include the country, I can do that. I could also insert a line here for care of, right? If we needed to make sure that that got to a specific person. And then if we wanted to include a note at the bottom, just remember that that would show up in that address window on your envelope and on your check stub, but you are welcome to put a note in here if you need that, okay? Now our shipped from address, right, if we are getting our goods from somewhere else and we want to track that, right, we can create a separate shipped from address. We give it a name, put in all the same information that we need. We could also just copy over that billed from address so that it all comes from the same place. Now the only thing here for our vendor that's required is going to be this vendor name, okay? Everything else here is optional, but you can only get out of QuickBooks what you put into it. So if there is information that you need to be able to access quickly and efficiently, we recommend that you put it in, okay? On our payment settings tab, there's actually quite a few helpful fields here. Now the account number, if you, again, if you were here last week, you know that this also exists on the customer side, and it's not always super helpful on the customer side. It's actually much more helpful here on the vendor side because you can opt to have QuickBooks put that account number in the memo field of any checks that you write or bills that you pay. So going back to having multiple vendors, right, multiple AT&T accounts, if we have an account number that we want to make sure this payment gets applied to the correct account, if we've populated this field, we can opt to have QuickBooks put that on the memo so that we know this check for this bill is going to be applied to that correct account. Payment terms here, these are set, right? We can set these up, we can customize these a little bit. This option here chooses the default so that when you go to create a bill for this vendor, that's what's going to default on that bill. You can always change that at the transaction level, but this is what the general terms would be for that employer. I mentioned this one earlier, this print on check as, right? So if we have a different vendor, right? Maybe it's not AT&T, maybe it's you know, a local business, right? And they have a DBA, right? We may want to include that information here, right? Company name, doing business as, whatever else. Or maybe the check needs to go to an individual, right? We can put that information here as well. So this can be different from both our vendor name and the customer name that we originally put in on that first address page. If we have a credit limit with that vendor, we don't want to spend more than or order more than X number of dollars or have X number of dollars in payables to this vendor, right? Or if they've set that limit for us, we can put that information in here. That's going to give us some warnings when we go to create an expense transaction that, hey, this transaction is going to exceed the credit limit that this vendor has set for you. Billing rate levels can be very, very helpful. I don't have any set up in here, but if you think about it, like a law firm, right? What you bill a client for a lawyer's tasks versus what you bill a client for a paralegal's tasks, for example, would be on two different billing rate levels, right? And so this relates to how we invoice our customers for the expenses that we've incurred by this particular vendor. Okay, so we can choose that billing rate level. We do have other videos, I believe, about that if we need to dive into that more closely. Tax settings here, if our vendor is eligible for a 1099, we can check that little box. We can fill in their tax ID, their EIN number. This helps when we go to e-file those 1099s. Okay. We can also, at the vendor level, if we have that W-9 from that vendor, we can also attach that W-9 directly to the vendor. We do have that option at the transaction level as well, but as a vendor-based document, right, that would be helpful to have there. Account settings. So some people use this, some people don't. There are other options to using this, but let's talk about it. So this gives us the ability to choose default expense accounts for when I pay a particular vendor, right? So for example, if I'm paying AT&T, that default account might be telephone expenses or internet expenses, right? I don't know that I actually have either of those here. Oh, there we are, telephone, right? So when we pay AT&T, we go to create a bill or a check, it's going to default to that telephone expense account. We can have up to 3, okay, so that is an option. This is something that we'd want to use a little bit of caution with, right? If we have vendors that we wouldn't always code to the same expense account, right? Office Depot, perhaps, right? That could be office supplies, that could be printing and marketing expenses, it could be a lot of different things, right? That may not be useful here. If we have a vendor that we purchase items from rather than just paying expenses, right? We have a materials vendor. We wouldn't necessarily want to fill this in, right? Because we're not usually just paying an expense, we're ordering product or raw materials to make our own products. The other option here, right, instead of using this is to set a preference here, and I believe that it is under General, to automatically recall the last transaction for this name, right? So when you put AT&T into our check or our bill, QuickBooks can automatically recall that last information. So it says, hey, last time you paid AT&T, it was to telephone. It's also going to recall the bill amount or the check amount, right? So if last month you paid AT&T and it was $150, and this month you go in to create a bill for this month's bill and you notice that it's $400 this month, right? That could be one of those little safety net things for you to go, hey, why are we being charged so much more this month? What changed? Or is that a miss bill on AT&T's behalf, right? So this could be useful for you as well. Either one is kind of going to do the same thing. It's going to populate that expense field for you. Just depends on what you prefer. Moving on to the additional info tab, vendor types. Those are very, very powerful. We can run reports based on those types of vendors, right? So if we pay consultants or we pay for materials or we pay permit vendors, right? We can track all sorts of different types of vendors here, okay? This is also a field that doesn't necessarily have to be used specifically for vendor types. We could set this up with our own kind of set of data that we want to track, right? It could be used more along the lines of class or other various types of data that we want to be able to track. Okay? There is the option in QuickBooks to also assign a class to our names rather than only at the transaction level. Okay, you don't see that option here because I don't have that preference enabled, but you do have that option. That could be helpful if you are using classes, but staff maybe keeps forgetting to fill in the class field. It might be helpful to assign the class to the name itself so that every time you create a transaction for this vendor or the customer for that matter, when we have that enabled, it works on that end as well, that it always defaults to that specific class. Okay. The caveat to doing that is that maybe that's not always the right class, right? But it would avoid the uncategorized column that you would get on your P&L if you are forgetting to fill in that class or your staff is forgetting to fill in that class. So that is an option. And then custom fields here, right? We can define these, set these up however we like with whatever information that we need to track, okay? If we needed to track a discount, if we needed to track maybe a former part number for this particular materials vendor, right? If they've updated their parts list and it used to be called part 123 and now it's called part ABC, right? We can put, hey, here's what this former part number was, just so that we can track that, okay? This is also one of those places where we can make this information required, okay? So remember I said on that address info tab, the only thing required there is the vendor name. But if there is other data that we need to make sure that we track, we can set that up as a custom field and require it when it is set up, okay? So we would just check the box here that says this is required when we set something up. So that's how we set that vendor up from here. So if we save our vendor here, so there's our new vendor, AT&T. Now, if we were to create a vendor from a transaction, right? Let's just say that we're going to enter a bill. Okay. So from here, right, if we have a vendor that we need to add that doesn't already exist, okay, if I hit tab here, QuickBooks is going to say, oh, this one's already in use in my customer list. I must have used this last week to set up my customers. So let's pick a different name. Let's choose United Way. Okay. And so we're going to get this pop here that says vendors not found in the list what we're going to do, okay? So we can choose to quick add, okay? And that's going to give you option to set up as vendor, and that's it. All it's going to put into the system name, that one required field on the vendor information page, okay? That's an option. Preferably, we're going to use our setup option instead, and then we'll get that same vendor card pop up here. If it will load there for me, there it goes. Okay, so then that's going to give us the opportunity to go ahead and put in all of that necessary information, account numbers, tax information, custom fields, all of those things while we're in the process of creating that expense transaction. Okay. All right, let's close out of here. All right, so that's kind of really all there is to vendors. There are, a few other special features, right? We can set certain vendors to be preferred vendors for our inventory items or raw materials, right? If we always buy this part from that vendor, we can set that up on the inventory side. There's a lot of different things that we can do. But as far as creating our vendors, setting them up, and how those fields work, that's kind of all there is to it. So we have a few minutes here. If anybody has any questions, if anybody has any input, anything that they want to share, I do see we've got a question here. Let's see. Can we set up vendors for T5018 reports? So that T5018, that's my understanding is that that's a Canadian tax form. So you would probably need to have the Canadian QuickBooks Enterprise in order to get that set up. So the US-based QuickBooks does have that 1099. That's the US tax form that we would set up for our vendors. So for Canadian forms, you'd want to have the Canadian QuickBooks Enterprise. How do we set up different remittance addresses like to a bank? So if we're sending the same bank checks for different accounts that go to different bank locations, if I'm understanding the question correctly, that's probably going to be best set up a lot like my AT&T account here is, right? So if we have loan 123 that goes to this branch of the bank, and we have loan 456 that goes to a different branch, we would probably want to set those up as different vendors, right? Vendors are one of the few names in QuickBooks that we can't set up a sub vendor. I have had a lot of clients make that request and wonder if that were to be an option at any point in the future. I think it would be very interesting to have that option, but we don't currently. So I would set up each of those banks, each of those remittance addresses as a different vendor. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to include multiple billed from or shipped from addresses here. Okay. Do we have webinars for QuickBooks Online? We do not, that I'm aware of, for QuickBooks Online, but we do have a lot of resources on our website, fourlane.com. We do have a YouTube channel where we do a lot of things in QuickBooks Online as far as setting up customers, vendors, all sorts of other things. Okay. More about class. Yes, so let me change my preference here. Oops, cancel. Let me go into my preferences here. And so that's going to be class tracking here, okay? And we can choose to assign those classes to names, right? By default, they're going to be assigned at the transaction level. We can choose to assign them to different places. And depending on our workflows, depending on the data that we're using classes to track, any one of these could be useful for us. Specifically, let's look at how that applies to names. We're going to say okay. And then if I go back in here into AT&T, and I go back to that additional info tab, now we have this class drop down, okay? So classes traditionally have been used to track just different divisions or departments, right? If we think of like a Macy's, we've got the men's and the women's and the kids and the house and all the things, right? Kitchen. And so that's traditionally how class has been used, but that's not to say that's how it has to be used. A lot of people will use this to track I actually have a client who is using it to track which attorney their legal case belongs to, right? Which attorney is responsible for that particular case. It could be used to track specific retail locations. If you're in retail, it could be used to track a variety of different things, right? And so that discussion is something that Fourlane specializes in, is how do we make sure that we're tracking this set of data? What's the best way to do that so that we can pull the necessary reports, get the data back out of the system in a format that is useful for you to make those business decisions, right? So depending on how you have those set up, right, you can use this at the name level, at the transaction level, etc. So if we were to set the class for a vendor, right, these don't really make sense for this particular vendor, but that's okay, we're gonna play along. So if we set the class here as new construction for this vendor, what that's going to do is when I go to enter a bill for this particular vendor, okay, you can see that the class here is going to default to new construction, right? So every time I go to pay this vendor, whether it's via a bill, a check, a credit card charge, etc., that class is going to default to be new construction. Okay? And what that means is that when I run a profit and loss by class, okay, anything that I've paid for that vendor, paid to AT&T, right, is going to show up in my new construction class column, right? It's going to say, hey, this expense is related to your new construction, okay? And so that's why it's important to make sure that we set up classes for the data that we do need to track and use them in a way that's going to benefit us, right? If we find that we're getting a lot of unclassified here, right, because maybe people are just forgetting to put the class in, or maybe people are just skipping over it, right? Sometimes we all get lazy and we like to skip steps. So if we find that we have a lot of data in this unclassified field, it may be useful to set that up at the name level or even at the account level, right? Or at the item level. And so that can kind of help automate the application of those classes so that we get more accurate, more complete tracking of that. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Well, that's what I've got for us today. I hope you guys learned something. I hope this has been helpful for you guys, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.